And it was a challenge to find ways to show them that poetry could relate to them and actually be useful to them, and sort of engage them with their own souls and their own spirits. It's interesting when you've got both William Wordsworth and Dorothy Wordsworth sometimes covering the same territory. And for those who are wary of poetry, I would suggest that they begin with prose. I would suggest they begin with Dorothy's journals and read what surprises and moves them. Not a lot. Read, for example, it's April the 3rd, read Dorothy's entry on April the 3rd and just see what she has to say about the landscape or the day of that kind. And often you'll find that there's a link between what Dorothy wrote and what her brother wrote. So then literally to look at the dates and go to the Wordsworth poem, if there is one, adjacent to her entry, and notice what you notice about it. Sometimes it's helpful just to read the poem aloud to yourself. Sometimes it's helpful just to notice, is there a phrase or two that stands out that feels true to me or accurate or surprising? And not even trouble about if you don't understand the rest of the poem. Just say, well, that little piece really speaks to me, that little moment. I mean, there's an old-fashioned practice which is called keeping a commonplace book. People used to do it in the 19th century and into the 20th century indeed, where you keep a plain notebook, and when you find a quote or a line or a piece of a song that particularly moves you, you just copy it in your best handwriting. Or nowadays you open a file on your computer and you just type it up. And then you essentially have a collection of your own treasures. So instead of feeling assailed by the immense length of Wordsworth's work, you say, well, here are 20 quotations of his that I really love, and I'm going to hold them in my heart and return to them. And then once you know them, you find yourself sharing them with friends. And that's rather wonderful too. Another thing I think, when I'm talking to people for whom poetry is not immediately attractive, sometimes it's worth just looking at the biography. And Wordsworth's biography is interesting. I mean, he has a mistress in France, he has an illegitimate child, he has a very passionate friendship with Coleridge. He starts out as a you might call a leftist activist type, and he becomes more reactive and old-fashioned as he ages. He's both very malleable and receptive to the world, and also quite stern and sort of hard-nosed, hard-headed. I think sometimes biography can help you enter the poems with more sympathy, perhaps. And then also to say that some of the reason people are put off poems is because it's in a language that to them is hard to understand. So if you want to understand it, sitting with a friend and talking it through together can be a useful thing. Another way is just to say, well, there are people who are writing in the Wordsworth tradition right now. Who are the nature poets of today? And I think of people like Kathleen Jamie, Mary Oliver, Jerry Cambridge, Wendell Berry. I mean, there's a tradition of nature writers that, if you're interested by it, can bring you back to Wordsworth with a new freshness, I think. My experience, and I worked for many years teaching teachers to use poetry in the classroom in America, mostly elementary school teachers, which would say, I guess, primary school teachers here, and 85% of them hated poetry. They really disliked it because it made them feel stupid. They'd been taught a very, very narrow band of what poetry was, a little bit of Robert Frost and a poem or two by Emily Dickinson, some Walt Whitman perhaps. And it was a challenge to find ways to show them that poetry could relate to them and actually be useful to them and sort of engage them with their own souls and their own spirits. And usually by the end of the two, I had a weekend with them as it were, in Las Vegas, Nevada, and then a month went by and they had to take poetry into their classrooms and teach 3 lessons and write some pieces, and then they had a second weekend. And usually by the end of the second weekend, they had found a way to enjoy poetry. And often they would say to me, I never knew, Sheila across the table until she wrote the poem about her mother committing suicide. I never had experienced who she was. And now we've all grown much, much closer because we've met each other through each other's poems. So it was a proof to me that poetry was, of the power of poetry. And indeed, in a way, the work with those teachers, which I did for about 10 years, all over the US, was probably part of what allowed me to write the Slowness book, because it showed me how to write about things that were precious to me in a language that was not academic and not sort of superior, because I'd been working so hard to try to persuade, in a way try to offer something that was precious to me, the act of looking, the act of writing poems, to this very recalcitrant group who didn't care for it and were just doing it to go through the motions because they had to get their master's degree and they needed me to, they needed to tick that box of poetry in the classroom. And often the interesting thing about that was that many times the children that they were teaching would write more interesting poems than the teachers themselves. The 9-year-olds would write wonderful poems because they had no sense that poetry wasn't fun or wasn't truthful or whatever else. But this is off the topic of Wordsworth.